The deployment of Kenya Defence Forces within her borders has sparked debate on whether the move is as stipulated in the interest of national security or to infringe upon the right to peacefully demonstrate. Let's take a look at the events leading up to the deployment and the reasons for the resistance. They were protests the magnitude of which had never been witnessed on Kenyan soil. A revolt against institutions which serve as the hallmarks of a functioning democracy. Fire and destruction visited on Parliament, City Hall and the Supreme Court. That very evening, Defence Cabinet Secretary Aden Duale issued the following notice. The Kenya Defence Forces is deployed on the 25th of June 2024 in support of the National Police Service in response to the security emergency caused by the ongoing violent protests in various parts of the Republic of Kenya, resulting in destruction and breaching of critical infrastructure. Duale anchoring the deployment on Article 241(3)(b) of the Constitution of Kenya, which states the Defence Forces shall assist and cooperate with other authorities in situations of emergency or disaster and report to the National Assembly whenever deployed in such circumstances. He also anchored the deployment on the Kenya Defence Forces Act, which in Section 34(2) provides the Cabinet Secretary shall within 24 hours issue a notice in the Gazette of the commencement of such deployment. The Law Society of Kenya moving to court to challenge the deployment as the National Assembly endorsed it in record time under a shroud of secrecy. The Law Society taking the dim view that it not only gave the national government a blank check with no limits imposed on the life of the operation or scope, but that it was intended to suppress the right to peaceably and unarmed demonstrate, picket and present petitions to public authorities as enshrined in Article 37 of the Constitution. High Court Judge Lawrence Mugambi on Thursday, however, ruled that the intervention of the military in supporting the National Police Service is necessary in view of the need to preserve order, peace, public safety and critical infrastructure as it is in conformity with the Constitution and the relevant statute and was properly invoked. The court also directed that the terms of military engagement and duration of engagement be clearly defined and gazetted within 2 days to alleviate public fear that their constitutional liberties could be in jeopardy. The court also left the door open to oversight the military deployment on observance of human rights. Following that order, the Cabinet Secretary Defence, Aden Duale, published another Gazette notice on Friday, stating the deployment will cover the 47 counties within the Republic of Kenya where critical installations and infrastructure are located and shall continue until normalcy is restored. But given the documented incidents of excessive use of force by the authorities, most recently in Rungai,
Nane serikali hata mwisa na wawa na moja msase nane mtoto hapa yote hakuna kama dogi hapa imebaki nyama. Ruto ni risasi 8, mtoto wako we ni baba risasi 8. Utakumbuka tu mjukuu wako upate risasi 8 utafanya aje?
And a criminal element emboldened by the protests.
Ni venye makarau bado hawakuwa wengi, walishindwa nguvu na hawa vijana. Lakini sasa ule na yeye alijionyesha yeye ni mafioso zaidi, yani akaona anaweza karibia wale mavijana na kulienda hivyo venye kulienda. Alinyang'anywa bunduki, hatujui kama ilipatikana.
Kari moja Yesu alipigwa sana, sijui hao waliaga, hao wako sawa, hao walipelekwa hospitali.
What does normalcy represent? As I mentioned earlier, I'm joined by two legal minds, one in studio, one joining us virtually from Johannesburg, South Africa. I'll begin with you, Professor Migai Ketch, inaugurated Professor of Law, and we also have joining us from South Africa, Thuku Mburu, who is a Program Officer, International Commission of Jurists, Kenya. And I'll begin with you, Prof. You wrote an article in response to the Security Emergency Original Gazette that was published with the signature of Aden Duale CS Defense. And thereafter, the LSK challenged it in court. The judge ruled it is in order, but in 2 days, give us the extent and the scope of the operation. Thereafter, Duale published another Gazette notice, and he said the KDF will be deployed in all 47 counties with the express intent of safeguarding critical infrastructure. And then he went on to say, until normalcy is restored. In your professional opinion, has he met the requirements of the court where this is concerned? Before we get into the law.
He has not met the, he has not complied with the terms of the orders of the court. Let me be specific, because I have the order of the court.
My director tells me you have receipts.
Yes, I always keep receipts. It is the only way for a lawyer to operate. The judge in the second, the judge issued 2 orders, 3 orders. Mm-hmm. And the judge says that, one, the intervention is necessary, but says that it is directed that the terms of the military engagement, the duration of the engagement be clearly defined. Clearly defined. When the Cabinet Secretary now tells us that the deployment shall continue until normalcy is resolved, is that clearly defined? Mm-hmm. And who will make that determination? And which leads me, I'll answer your question around, I thought we can talk about what it means to govern security in a democracy.
All right, we'll get into that. But first, yes. Thuku, the International Commission of Jurists had raised the same concern. What is the scope of this operation? For how long and in what areas? What do you make of the recent development where the Defense CS says until normalcy is restored and covers the entirety of Kenya?
Thank you, Oliver, and thank you for having us speak on this session. And like Prof said, the orders were very clear, and the vagueness, the Gazette notice that was given by the Cabinet Secretary should be put into question and should be interrogated further by Kenyans. So you see, it was a wrong political decision that was being made by the executive. And you see that wrong political decision was seen on the 25th of June when he was trying to purport to order a state of emergency under Article 241B. That there's an emergency and there's a disaster. After they realized that mistake, they reassembled very fast in Parliament the next morning to get Parliament to approve that no, it's not a disaster, it's not an emergency, it's actually unrest and instability. And like you've also mentioned in your highlights, it's shrouded in secrecy. And we have it from members of Parliament from the opposition saying that this motion was debated for just 30 minutes. There was no media. Kenyans don't have access to the answers on the deliberations that were made. We don't know the modus operandi of the KDF deployment. And like Prof said, I don't think the situation in Kenya warrants to be interpreted as a state of emergency or as a conflict that warrants the deployment of the Kenyan Defense Forces among civilians.
All right. Professor Migai Ketch, you've written on this subject, and you viewed it with suspicion that this was anchored on Article 241(3)(b). Why is that?
So I think we need to put this in context in what it means to govern ourselves, to govern security in a democracy. Because fundamentally, a democracy is about freedom of expression. It is about exchange of ideas. When you bring in the military into the governance of a state, you reduce the democratic space. And you introduce fear in the lives of people. And if you have seen the terms of the Gazette notice now they're also talking about surveillance. What do the defense forces have to do with the spaces in which the public are expressing how they want to be governed, for example? And so also, what the government has done is to really just introduce a state of emergency through the back door, using that article 241(3)(b). Because look at it, what they have done is declare a security, deploy the security forces for a term that is unlimited, doing God knows what. And if you look at international law, the threshold for a state of emergency is a very high one. It is very, very difficult to meet. Because in international law, you only declare a public emergency in a situation of exceptional and actual or imminent danger which threatens the life of the nation. Now, can we, by any definition, say that what transpired last week threatens the life of the nation, or it threatens the life of a political regime? And again, in international law, the declaration of a public emergency or a state of emergency cannot be used to resolve a situation of political unrest, which is what we have here.
But listening to Judge Lawrence Mugambi, and Thuku pose this question to you, he said, he pointed out that Parliament was essentially invaded. The Supreme Court was vandalized. We had fire set to the City Hall. Does that not qualify then as an emergency?
That doesn't qualify as an emergency. Let's just start from there. Because we know the peaceful protests that were being held across the country were infiltrated by sections of the citizenry that now started looting, destroying property, and in that process, some other people were also injured. But that is not enough to say that the country is now unstable and not operate. And this was, so the political elite felt threatened by this. And you see, protests are a language of people that are not being heard. It is a language of the unheard. And people, in expressing that anger, then were invaded Parliament. But I don't think invading Parliament buildings warrants the deployment of KDF amongst civilians. So I think the learned judge erred in that sense, when because as Prof now explains, there are grave violations that people will face. Freedom of expression, for instance, will be curtailed. Freedom of movement will be curtailed. Freedom of persons and their security. We saw people being now abducted in commando style, without any cause, arbitrarily, So these reasons are very strong reasons against why the deployment should not have happened. People have seen what militaries have done in other states, and they wouldn't want to see that happening in Kenya. So when a political regime, and the deputy president is on record saying this, that the justice system or the policing system in Kenya cannot be used to criminalize people, and when people are trying to hold them into account. So I don't think those reasons justify the deployment of KDF among civilians.
All right, Prof, sorry.
If I may just comment on that as well. International law also requires that declaration be made in good faith. and on the basis of an objective assessment. If you look at what is going on, surely the solution is a simple one. It was to listen to the public, withdraw the finance bill. It is to resolve all the political questions.
But they withdrew the finance bill and still people went back to the streets.
There are very many issues around the use of our taxes. For example...
All right, I really don't want to get into that because of time, but you raised an issue with the orders, especially in respect to the 2 days that were given to correct the failure to include the extent of the operation. Why is that? Did that not also happen with the affordable housing levy? They said there are some things perhaps which are irregular, but we'll give you time up until this point to get your house in order.
You know, courts are not in the business of implementation. Courts are in the business of declaring rights. It should not be the duty of a judge to tell the executive what to do. The executive either complies with the law or doesn't. So when the executive comes with an order that does not obey the law, the judge's duty is a simple one. Declare that order unlawful and take it back to the executive and tell the executive, please come back with an order that obeys the law. Because as you've seen, what the judge did was to give them a blank check. And they filled it with very many zeros, including now telling us about surveillance. That is not the intention of the Constitution.
All right. Thuku, something that you raised, because the ICJ has written extensively on these protests since they began, and this will be your last comment on this issue, so you can tag on your final remarks. And this is what you wrote, that following the 25th June Gazette notice by defense, and by you I mean the ICJ, following the 25th June Gazette notice by Defense Cabinet Secretary Aden Duale and the National Assembly's approval on 26th June, the army was deployed to support the National Police Service. After the military's deployment on 27th June, human rights observers have documented the unlawful dispersal of peaceful gatherings, arbitrary arrest of protesters and their ill treatment, including stripping protesters semi-naked. And you go on to make the point that while those who may not protest peacefully forfeit the protection of peaceful protest under the Bill of Rights, they do maintain the other rights. And why did you find it necessary to make that point?
We found it necessary to make that point because we know and we understand the nature of protests, especially protests that are faceless, that don't have an apparent leader. So the nature of such protests are sometimes they are infiltrated with violence. We have citizens or people who we can call opportunists who take advantage of such protests and cause violence, breach peace, destroy property, and even cause harm to others. But even as they do that, they are properly laid out procedures on how such protesters can be handled, or such opportunists should be handled. And the proper law is that arrests should be conducted, and not in the commando style that we have seen. Arrests should be conducted procedurally. So police should arrest these people. And during such protests, police also have the duty to de-escalate situations, assess situations, and see the kind of force that they are supposed to use. But in our situation, we've seen police using disproportionate, excessive, and unnecessary force, leading to the deaths of protesters. So what we are saying is that even as protesters, even as we have opportunists infiltrating the protests, police should continue to do their work according to law. So, and maybe my final remark will be, one, the world is watching, and kudos to the young generation and Kenyans at large, because now Kenyans have shown that they are acutely aware of the outwards journey that has gotten us to the current state of governance that we are in. And any clawbacks to these democratic gains that we have had by any institution, that be it the executive, be it the courts, be it our legislative, if they are going to introduce any clawbacks, then Kenyans should frown upon such clawbacks. So Kenyans should remain steadfast and will remain vigilant against such clawbacks. Thank you.
All right, for that, Thuku. Lastly, Prof, makosa iko wapi? Article 241(3)(b says, in fact, more than that, even the KDF Act provides for KDF to come in and provide assistance where needed. We have seen KDF provide assistance in the North Rift. In Rongai, look at the incident. Police were overwhelmed. Supermarkets were overrun. In a situation like that, if you have the mechanism to bolster your security infrastructure, why not take that option?
Then, in that, obviously, there's nothing wrong with the army or the defense forces assisting the police. The trouble is the rationale for doing it. If the crisis is something that can be resolved politically, for example, and this is a political crisis. This is not a situation that cannot be managed long term. You're talking about something that happened over a few hours, isn't it? If the government goes back and says, okay, why is this happening? What is the root cause of this? The root cause of this is bad governance. And if you listen to the people, whether it is in the Twitter or X space or in the conversation that the people have about how they're governed, you will know. So obviously, there is a solution to it. The solution is not to bring the military to resolve a political problem.
All right.
It is what the government is clearly facing is a crisis of legitimacy. It's not a crisis of security.
All right, point made. Let me thank you, Professor Migai Ketch, inaugurated Professor of Law, for lending your expertise this evening. I also want to thank you, Thuku Mburu, all the way from Johannesburg, South Africa, for giving us your input as well. We take a break, but the conversation continues on the other side. This time, I will have in studio retired Colonel Julius Minyuri, and we'll also have in studio a peace and security expert, and that is Dr. Ocheng Kamudhai, and they will be giving the more operational perspective. See you on the other side.